is the salt of life. Life has no flavor if you don't try to have fun. Harja, Kadil, Merawat, Pa, Merawat. Wherever the heart goes, the legs go. Follow your intuition. Your heart will tell you what is the right path. Dunya, Baumit Zindas. The world is alive with hope. Always have hope, because there always is hope. These were some of the proverbs of Zarbul Masalha, 151 Afghan Dari Proverbs. Welcome with Afghan Voice Radio, and this time we have an interview with Edward Zellem. Edward Zellem is a US Navy captain, but he's also the author of Zarbul Masalha, 151 Afghan Dari Proverbs and Afghan Proverbs Illustrated. And this time in this interview, he will be speaking as a private citizen about his passion for proverbs and Afghan proverbs in special. Welcome, Edward Zellem, and can you introduce yourself a little bit more for our listeners?
Yes, thank you, Ariadne, and thank you, and I hope you and your listeners are healthy and well. But I am, as you said, a U.S. Navy captain, although I'm speaking here as a private citizen. I studied Dari in a full immersion program for 5 months, and then spent a year and a half in Afghanistan, and that's where my passion for Proverbs took hold. And eventually became 8 books in 8 different languages.
My first question is, why is it important to gain understanding about the Afghan cultures?
I think that it's important to understand all cultures, regardless, of your own nationality. And there's actually an Afghan proverb that expresses that very well. It says, Dil ba dil rag darad, which means heart to heart there is a way. And that proverb is about connecting. And, some people have said my books, are about winning hearts and minds, and I think it's a mistake to think of it that way, because winning implies that somebody's losing, and nobody loses here. To me, it's about connecting hearts and minds, and that's what I found that almost by accident that the books have done.
About your expectations and perspectives on Afghans and Afghanistan, were they different before you went there, and did these expectations change during your visit to Afghanistan and also studying the language and the proverbs?
Well, that's a great question. I really did have no expectations about Afghans before I went to Afghanistan because I'd never met an Afghan. But all my instructors in language school were Afghans. And I found while I was learning the language and working with the instructors that, I thought they were pretty cool. And I got to Afghanistan and I found that most of the Afghans I was dealing with were pretty cool too, and we had a lot in common, especially when we're working in Afghan languages. So that's, in an accidental way, again, that's become, one of the things I'm doing with the books. I hope that the books help the world find out that Afghans are cool, because I think Afghans are cool. And as in every country, there's a U.S. Navy proverb that says 5% of the crew causes 95% of the problems, and that's true in Afghanistan. That's true everywhere. Most Afghans, 95% of Afghans are cool, and that's what I want to show the world.
Did the books help the United States to understand, or the military understand Afghanistan better and the Afghan culture a bit better?
Well, I hope so. I mean, there's been a lot of interest, from soldiers from different countries, who go to Afghanistan, because I think most military people genuinely do want to understand Afghans better and be able to communicate with Afghans better. And so yes, but again, the book is not a military project. It's a private project. It's a hobby that became a passion, that became a book. And it's 8 books, actually, and more on the way. So the short answer is yes. I do think it has helped and can help the military and any foreigner working with Afghans.
And your passion for proverbs, it started during learning the Dari language?
It did. I started out in life, I was an athlete. I played football in college, American football. And one of the things I found is that, coaches use proverbs all the time to motivate people. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. It's a sports proverb. And I mentioned a Navy proverb earlier about the 95%. So, I think I was probably naturally inclined to enjoy proverbs and use them because of their deep meaning and shorthand for important thoughts. And so I suppose looking back, I was probably a natural receptacle enjoy Afghan proverbs.
What I noticed when I was reading about you and more about the proverbs and the books, I started actually realizing I use a lot of proverbs myself, and these are Dutch proverbs because I'm Dutch. And even in the way I think, and I didn't realize that before, because you do that automatically. And I would like to ask you, what is the importance of proverbs and culture in society?
Well, you and I share that discovery because I discovered that too. And the third language translators of Afghan Proverbs Illustrated, my second book, have also discovered that in the process of translation. It's in 6 different languages now, if you don't count English and Dari, and there are more on the way. So every culture has proverbs because they're a shorthand for deep meaning, and they're passed on traditionally through the centuries, and even millennia. And they're a great way for people to meet and connect socially. There's an Afghan proverb that describes that as "Gap Gap Mekezad." From talk comes talk. Good conversations lead to more good conversations. And proverbs lead to good conversations. They lead to discussion. They lead to dialogue. And so proverbs are important in every culture, and I've learned that along the way.
They add an extra and deeper meaning to communication, isn't it?
Quite so. And you know what? They're also very colorful, and they're fun, too. It makes conversation fun. Much better than just stating the facts. It creates dialogue, it creates communication, it creates an openness in relating to people, and so yes, and again, I discovered that by accident as my hobby turned into a passion, and it turned into books. And you're exactly right.
Okay. You wrote the book Zarbul Masalha, 151 Afghan Proverbs, and that is translated in, like you say, 6 different languages and available in 35 countries worldwide. When I read the title of the book, I was wondering, why 151 Proverbs? Well,
great question, Ariadne. And first of all, a lot of people ask me what Zarbul Masalha means in Dari if they don't speak Dari. And Zarbul Masalha means Proverbs. It's a very simple title. If I'm feeling playful and people ask why 151, I'll sometimes tell them that 151 is a mystical Afghan number, associated with Sufism and the whirling dervishes. But that's not exactly true. In fact, that's not true at all. I had to stop somewhere after I exceeded about 200 proverbs, and I just wrote them down as I heard them and used them talking with Afghans. So I had to stop somewhere, and 151 seemed like a good number.
And how did you select the proverbs for your book?
Well, I was looking for proverbs. I selected proverbs that for my collection that I thought represented Afghan society, first of all, and the Afghan way of thinking, and secondly, proverbs that were commonly used by Afghans. Every proverb in the book is a proverb that I heard people use. I didn't go to libraries. I didn't Google stuff. These are all proverbs that people use in their day-to-day speech in Afghanistan. And Afghans, as you know, use a lot of proverbs when they speak. It's a colorful tradition of speaking that goes back, to the ancient, culture of the Persian courts, where that kind of speaking is very highly valued.
Did you have a look into the history of the Afghan proverbs as well?
Well, I've started to. And again, this started as a hobby and a learning tool, and it was more of a fun thing for me. But yes, as things have evolved, I did. Some of them derive from ancient poetry of Rumi and Hafez. Some of your listeners will be familiar with that. Some of them derive from Hadith, from the Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him. And so, in fact, there's a very famous Afghan proverb about education. Zegawara tagur danesh bajoy. This means from cradle to grave, one should learn. And I didn't learn until after the book was published that was actually a saying of the Prophet Muhammad. So they come from all over the place, but many very historic.
Besides the 151 Proverbs book, you also wrote Afghan Proverbs Illustrated. Why did you decide to publish an illustrated book?
Well, after the 151 Proverbs book started to become popular around the world, people started contacting me, especially Afghans living overseas, and they said, my kids, were born in in another country. They weren't born in Afghanistan. And I'm trying to teach them Dari. I'm trying to teach them about our culture. Could you publish an edition designed for children? And so that's what I did with Afghan Proverbs Illustrated. It's full color, it's large size, large print, and became very well received in that regard. And adults found it equally useful. It's a great coffee table book, and then that evolved into the additional languages you mentioned. And so now Afghan Proverbs Illustrated, the English Dari edition, has been published in 6 different languages, more on the way.
And these illustrations, would they help illiterate people as well?
Well, they do, and that's, again, one of the accidental things. There really hasn't been a plan for these books. I wish I could say there was, but yes, I discovered a high school in Afghanistan, Marifat High School, that's has a wonderful art program. It's not an art school, it's a high school, but it has a great art program. And the students from Marifat High School painted 50 original illustrations for the book. The first edition actually was published in Afghanistan in 2011, and I worked together with Marifat High School, and we published 40,000 of those books in Afghanistan with an Afghan local printer. And those were distributed to over 200 schools throughout Afghanistan and are now part of the curriculum. So short answer is Marifat High School in Kabul did the illustrations, and I'm very, very grateful. And their collaboration, my collaboration with them, is something that I'll never forget. Brilliant bunch of kids.
The book is being sold in many different languages in many different countries. Where's the money you raise with the project going to?
Well, I made a decision at the very beginning that these are Afghan proverbs. They belong to Afghans, and I believe that the future of Afghanistan rests on literacy and cross-cultural communication. So I decided to donate all the net proceeds from all my books to support Afghan literacy programs and projects throughout the world. So I've donated 500 books to Kabul University at the request of Nancy Dupree, who some of your readers may be familiar with. I'm about to ship 100 copies of the German edition to the German school in Kabul. Those who've been to Kabul will know the German school right near the presidential palace. I've sent money back to Marifat, of course. So short answer, the books are Afghan proverbs. They belong to Afghans, and I want the proceeds to support Afghan literacy.
So there is not just a lot of interest from around the world for the book, but also a huge interest in Afghanistan itself.
Well, there is, and one of the challenges I've found in Afghanistan is simply distribution. Afghans have a hard time using credit cards to buy books, for example, online. A lot of booksellers won't accept a credit card from Afghanistan, sadly, right now. Another problem is the postal system. A lot of Afghans don't have a mailing address that works all the time very well. So if any of your listeners know of a way to get the books into actual bookstores in Afghanistan, I'd love to hear from them. And you can contact me through my website, afghansayings.com. And I'd be happy to discuss that with anybody.
For other people outside of Afghanistan, where can people order the books?
Well, as you said, the books are available in over 35 countries. Whatever your major online bookseller is, chances are it's there. And Amazon.com in the U.S. and European Amazon affiliates carry all the books. If you want to buy the Russian edition in Russia, that's available on Beirut.com. If you want to buy the books in India, it's available on Jungli.com. Sweden, Bocus.com. If you go to AfghanProverbs.com, my first website, or AfghanSayings.com, you can find some guidance and links to places you can buy the book no matter what country you're in.
The many languages has been translated in. How did the interest come from all those different languages? Is it your own interest, or did other countries come to you?
Well, it started out, again, it was almost accidental. I started out, I knew there were a lot of Afghans in Germany, and I had a volunteer offered, and all the translators are volunteers, because it's for literacy programs. I was approached by a German-American woman, actually, who offered to translate the book into German, and that became popular. And then I went with the French edition. French Army Lieutenant Colonel, who I served with in Afghanistan, did the French edition. And then it started to snowball, and people began approaching me regarding third language translations of the books. One of the most interesting, if I could, is a Swedish social worker named Karen Johansson approached me about a Swedish Dari edition. She's a social worker. She works with Afghan refugees in Sweden, and she had been using the English Dari edition to help integrate Afghan refugees in Sweden. And she thought, let's take it one step farther and do a Swedish Dari edition. And so that was published about a month ago. And now I have there's a Greek social worker in Greece working with Afghan refugees who's doing the same thing. So that's an unexpected development that I think is that I love, and I think it's wonderful that people are using the books in this way.
And it is still growing, and you won't stop here either, because there's a new project as well, and that is you're working on Pashto Proverbs, and that will be called Mataluna 151 Afghan Pashto Proverbs. Is that correct?
That's correct, and Mataluna also means Proverbs in Pashto. The question everybody asks me is, there are two major languages in Afghanistan, Dari and Pashto. When are you going to do the Pashto Proverbs? And of course, I'm not in Afghanistan right now, and I can't collect Pashto Proverbs face-to-face the way I did Dari Proverbs. So I decided to try something new. And if you've heard of crowdsourcing, this is something that people do on the internet they're trying to fund an independent film or a project. Crowdsourcing is where you go out to a large group of people online, you collect, say $1, or €1 per book, and or per person, and that becomes funding for your project. Well, I decided for Mataluna and the Proverbs collection in Pashto to try crowdsourcing content, not money. And so I set up a collection site on AfghanProverbs.com and announced it through Twitter. I have a lot of Twitter followers on Twitter at Afghan Sayings, over 1,500 now. And people from around the world started sending me Pashto Proverbs through this crowdsourcing site that I set up on AfghanProverbs.com. And I'm still collecting. Mataluna, I've already collected over 200, and they're being illustrated right now by the same high school in Marifat, I'm pleased to say, same high school in Afghanistan. But I'll always take more. So AfghanProverbs.com, the Pashto Proverbs Project, please send it.
This is also the way people can follow up the development of this project and also of the Dari project.
That's exactly right. I try and keep the followers up, and there are lots of them now. I try and keep everybody up to date through my new website, AfghanSayings.com, my original website, AfghanProverbs.com. I tweet Afghan Proverbs usually 3 times a day to account for time zones on Afghan Sayings on Twitter. And so you can get a free proverb every day. I alternate in Dari and Pashto on alternating days. And sometimes I'll put out a proverb that relates to the news. Sometimes I'll put out a proverb that relates to how I'm feeling that day. Sometimes it'll be directed to one particular person that I have a message for, and they're all good messages, by the way. But yeah. So you can follow me on Twitter at Afghan Sayings, and that'll also I'll link you into the network. And of course, I'm on Facebook too. I put lots of news on Facebook, just under my personal page. My name, Edward Zellem. And I think we're getting to the end of this interview. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners? Well, I guess I'd like to leave your listeners or our listeners with an Afghan proverb that really resonates with me and a lot of people. It's Pushti har taraki roshani ast, which means after every darkness is light. In English, we say there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Afghanistan is coming out of a very, very dark time, 30 plus years of war. Some people think the future isn't bright, but I think the future is bright. It can be bright. If people band together, if people communicate, Proverbs are one way to do that. So after every darkness and light, I hope is light, and I hope people remember that.
Well, thank you very much. I would say Tashakor Diramanana, and dankjewel in Dutch.
Batsesam, with pleasure. And Kabili Tasikurnest, there's no need to thank me. I thank you. It's great to speak with you, Ariadne, and with the Afghan Voice listeners.
Yeah, and maybe in the future there's going to be a follow-up on the interview when the Pashto book is ready.
I'd be happy to. I can talk about Afghan Proverbs all day.
Well, thank you very much. And Khuda Hafiz, Khuda Thaman.
Khuda Hafiz, Buzz Moving, and we'll see you again.
Say you wanna